It is a fact of American politics right now that one party, the Republican Party, is overwhelmingly white, at least in its representation and its voters, its institutions. One party is not. It's also a fact that one of the main thrusts of the Republican Party's midterm strategy this year was rooted in bigotry and racism. The president spent the weeks before the midterms fanning the flames of racial fear by depicting Central American migrants as invading marauders. While that message may have motivated the Republican electorate, they still lost big. The new class of Democrats who are elected is a group that's closer to reflecting what America looks like than ever before. The question is this the start of something new in American politics or just a classic midterm course correction? Joining me now is author and journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose most recent work, We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy, is now out in paperback. Great to have you here, man.
Great to be back.
So one of the essays in that book is called The First White President.
Was I, the last time I was here, was it to talk about that?
It might have been.
It might have
You
been.
stay
I
off
feel like
TV because you're writing so much.
Yeah, but I feel like we're picking right up.
Well, because in some ways it's like a check-in on a bunch of the theses in that essay, which is that this is a man who harnessed the power of whiteness in a way no one had before because no one had ever succeeded a black president. Where is that project now after these midterms?
I think it's probably exactly where I'm trying to figure out how to say this without sounding arrogant. It's about where I thought it would be.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's quite a bit that bears it out. There's quite a bit of research. You know, it's come out since then. There's, Michael Tesla's book, which you talked about on your podcast, Talking with Tesla. I think all of the research has pretty much undergirded that. But I think more importantly, the history was already there. It was quite clear. And so the expectation that Trump would be anything else, I think is quite naive. It goes against the data, goes against the history, and goes against his own actual biography.
But you're talking about the ways in which all this data, Michael Tesler's a political scientist I talked with on the podcast, about all the ways in which first Obama and then Trump in different ways, right, cultivated and activated white voters' racial anxieties, racial fears.
Well, I just want to be clear about it. I don't think Obama activated it.
No.
The
presence, the existence of a black
He
man.
activated it by breathing.
Right, yes.
And being president.
He did not cultivate it.
Right. Which is very different than what Trump did.
Exactly.
Which was an active attempt to, stir it up. And in many ways, I think there was a kind of genius to Trump in the sense that for years, it was this notion that the Republican Party was all these other things. It was, a party of a kind of principled conservatism, free market politics, religion. And there are people who, legitimate, serious people that believe in that. But Trump was able to say, no, you're this.
Right.
This is your essence right here. This is your essence. And that's what we see right now.
Someone made the point the other day, I think it was actually Selena Zito, who's a conservative writer, wrote that, Trump, there's this sort of argument about whether Trump's base is racist or not, and said, Trump clearly thinks they are.
Right, Trump.
It's clearly Trump's judgment that these people are racist because look at the way he campaigns to them.
Right. No, it's quite clear. And again, I mean, it's not a mistake. It's not a shock. I think, though, maybe, I feel like when I published that piece, there was still some debate. I think the debate is disappearing.
I agree the debate's disappearing, but what I think is interesting about the midterms is it also shows there is a limitation to the electoral efficacy of that appeal.
Well, right now it is. I was looking at the results, but I've been very encouraged, no matter what happens in Florida or Georgia, by, the campaign that, Abrams ran and that Gillum ran. It's a very, very encouraging campaign because I think, they stood right on and said, this is who we are. And no matter what happens, came damn close, really, really close. And so I think it's, a statement for folks of our political persuasion for how to proceed. But you can't guarantee if those governorships go the other way, the election laws will be the same next time. Right. You just don't know. I mean, I have been a skeptic of believing in demographics, saying, okay, well, we'll just run this again.
Right.
You just don't know. You just don't know it's going to be the same.
Well, it's also the case, right, that nothing stays fixed in politics.
That's right.
Right. So one of the things in the South, and this is what I think is remarkable at Stacey Abrams, who, whether she wins or loses, has 200,000 more votes than the last person to try this.
Wow.
A white man named Jason Carter with the most famous name in Democratic politics in the state, right? That the legacy of the South is you can't mobilize black voters without doing something else, which is mobilizing a lot of white voters, too.
Right. That's exactly it. And so the optimistic piece of this would say, though, every year we get a little bit more browner, a little bit more blacker. But again, you can't assume that the laws are going to stay fixed, though. And I think, when I think back to 2008, how excited a lot of folks were about the presence of, your first black president. One of the great mistakes that was made was not to assume that there's going to be a response to this, that some people are going to see this. And there are other people who, for instance, who are watching how close Gillum and Abrams got. And they're saying,
thinking about.
And they're thinking, about how to actually respond to that. And so I think folks should not sit pat.
But the other part of that, too, is, and I think this is the thing that's been encouraging me about the midterms, is that backlash works in both directions.
Yes.
Which is that it's also the case that there's a contingent of Americans who watch Donald Trump, and they're the majority. I mean, if you look at the majority, there's a huge millions and millions of people watch this and think, yeah, this is awful. This is awful bigotry and racism. And not just people of color, but like white voters, too.
Right. But, I have to tell you, I wonder if this is how bigotry and racism in particular, to some extent, always work. Okay, so you need a critical mass of deep believers, who are hardcore racists. But you don't actually need the majority to be hardcore racists.
No.
What you need is for the majority to be willing to look the other way. And so, you talk about say segregation in the era of Jim Crow. You didn't need the whole town to go to the lynching. You just needed a hardcore group who felt that lynching had to happen, And so I am always skeptical of these notions of progress. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think it deserves some pushback.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that what's unnerving in some ways is about the way in which he seems to recognize that you can cultivate a very powerful 38% of the country, 40% of the country, predominantly white. The data shows predominantly with racial attitudes that are fearful and prejudiced and skeptical, and wield that power. I mean, he seems to get that.
So the question I have going forward, and I know you've dealt with this question quite a bit, is what does it mean for us as a democracy when you only actually have to motivate a minority?
Yes.
You know what I mean? And nevertheless, you can, be in a situation where you get a Justice Kavanaugh. Like there are results to this where you can, affect the Supreme Court. In such a historic way. This white word that Republicans have chased for years, and by activating a minority, I agree with you. I don't think it's actually the majority of Americans.
No, but it's the power of that minority they've activated.
And so what does that mean for how we're set up as an actual government?
I wanted to, there's been this story about the way that he's treated certain journalists, particularly black women, over the last few weeks. Even by his standards, I think particularly disgusting, if I can editorialize for a moment. This moment I thought was really interesting in the context of what you've written about and about the data about people. This is him talking to Yamiche Alcindor and his response to her. Take a listen.
On the campaign trail, you called yourself a nationalist. Some people saw that as emboldening white nationalists. Now people are also saying that the president.
It's such a racist
There are
question.
some people that say that now the Republican Party is seen as supporting white nationalists because of your rhetoric. What do you make of that?
I don't believe it. I don't know. Why do I have my highest poll numbers ever with African Americans? That's such a racist question. Honestly, I mean, I know you have it written down and you're going to tell me. Let me tell you, it's a racist question. Excuse me. But to say that, what you said, is so insulting to me. It's a very terrible thing that you said.
It's a racist question. What's going on there?
Well, I mean, it combines Donald Trump's two great loves, racism and misogyny. So that's the first thing that's going on. The second thing is one of the highlights of white supremacy as a force and racism as a force is this kind of truculent, objecting. How dare you? I mean, so you're a racist for actually even implying that, something I said might have been racist. So, I mean, it's typical Trump. I mean, for Yamiche and for, the other, black women who have been insulted like this, over the past week, while it is, completely predictable, I still think it's absolutely outrageous and disgusting. And I think that needs to be said.
Yeah. Ta-Nehisi Coates, thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.